is a little harder, but we're very much glad to have you and glad to be back in person. We have two speakers tonight. So Carolyn Eastman is a professor in the history department, and John Augenbaugh is a professor in the political science department. They're going to talk to us about prohibition. We would have done this last year, which would have been the anniversary, except evil COVID got in the way. So we're doing it this year. If there's something that you want to suggest that we cover next year, Carolyn would be all ears to hear that, because it's her turn to pick for next year. So just as a couple of business items before we get started. So Carolyn will speak, and then Augie will speak, and then we'll have question answer after that. So we're not, if you don't mind holding your questions, you're sitting in front of giant pieces of paper with crayons. So if you want to make a note for yourself of something you want to ask, please feel free. Please also feel free to doodle or draw things or whatever you like while it's going on. There are drinks and candies in the back. And this is how obsessive I am. Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Nia Rogers. I'm sorry. And I'm the government documents librarian. I'm also the political science, the Wilder School, and the journalism librarian. So those are my areas of specialty, and I apologize for not interrupting myself, just start talking. Please feel free to grab a drink. Please feel free to grab some candy. The candy is all from the time period that we're talking about, because I'm a little tiny bit obsessive. And so I was like, wait, what candy did they have in the 20s? Because that'll make the experience even better for people. So, you know, take that with what you will. And also the constitutions that are on the table are for you to take. If you would like to take one, take it away. We're happy to have you have those. So thank you so much for attending. And Carolyn, would you like to give us started? Thank you.
All right, can you hear me? Anybody not able to hear me? Thank you. Thank you, Nia. And thank you all for coming. You know, we have been doing this virtually for 2 years, and I really have missed having actual people in front of me. So truly, thank you so much for coming. And, you know, I wanted to begin by talking about the precursor, mostly about a decade before the prohibition, the national prohibition of alcohol. And as I was thinking about this larger question, what made Americans turn against alcohol? I started thinking about how many of us have never really thought through our own feelings about it, right? So some of us are maybe, you know, 100% in favor of booze. Others are, for many reasons, 100% against, but most of us are sort of in the middle. We have our own opinions about how much it's appropriate to drink. At what point is someone sort of ugly drunk? Is it appropriate for people to get that drunk? What happens when someone is drunk? I mean, we live in a culture, you know, in which we're surrounded by stories of sexual abuse during drunken fests and so on. And so I think it's helpful to look back at American history and ask this question, because I think it raises a lot of issues that we still deal with today. So I'm going to talk about 3 things, and I'm going to move through the first 2 quite quickly. The first is the question of why did Americans begin to see alcohol as a problem? And that's because this is not a given. I mean, Americans drank more than you could imagine in early America. And so their turn against alcohol is quite striking. Second, I want to look at how the temperance movement began to try to curb alcohol use in America. And then finally, I want to talk about the role of women, the crucial role of women in fighting against alcohol and fighting for prohibition. So that's where I'm going today. So the first one is, how is it that Americans began to see alcohol as a problem? And here, I mean, overwhelmingly, what I want to get across is how prevalent alcohol was in early America. Alcohol consumption from the 1600s, when Europeans began colonizing what became the United States, all the way to the 1810s or so, was dominated by an attitude of the more alcohol, the better. I mean, this quote liquor at that time was used as commonly as the food we ate is a common a saying about that period. It was, alcohol was everywhere. And the reason why was because most water was so unsafe to drink. I mean, you'd get sick if you drank a lot of the water in most areas of the United States. And so what you found was that if you turned that water into an alcoholic drink, even a small amount, so like small beer, for example, was a very low alcohol kind of beer, maybe 1 to 2%. Wines didn't have a super high alcohol content. That made the water safe to drink. And because of the importance of simply getting enough to drink, you found that that booze, beer, wine, and spirits was just fundamental to American life. So when you woke up, you had small beer for breakfast. You went to work, you had a break mid-morning, you had alcohol. You had alcohol at your meals. You took a break in the afternoon, you had more booze. This was just absolutely part of the fabric of life, and people didn't talk about it being a problem. But during the 18th century, during the 1700s, high-proof alcohol proliferated in the American colonies and the new United States. And so what you began to see was that really very alcoholic drinks like gin and rum and whiskey became cheap. They were everywhere. And so instead of having maybe some small beer or some wine at your mid-morning break, you were having a dram of whiskey, you were having a dram of rum. And all of that meant that people were drinking more and more and more, to the extent that by 1820, Americans imbibed more high-proof alcohol than ever before or since. They were drinking almost 7 times as much as they had drunk 100 years earlier. And this caused the kinds of problems you can imagine, right? You started to see a lot more people getting drunk in public and causing a public disturbance. You started to see drunk people outside of dram shops beating each other up. You started to see people going home and beating their families. And so in a lot of ways, the proliferation of alcohol began to cause people to have questions about alcohol in American life. And in fact, you can see on this chart that, you know, in the around 1720 or so, the amount of alcohol was about this is distilled spirits, so high proof liquor was about 2 gallons. By 1820, Americans were drinking 5 gallons of alcohol per capita every year. I mean, and just to put this in perspective, maybe some of you enjoy a nice high proof alcohol, right? Well, today, Americans drink about 3/4 of a gallon of high proof alcohol a year. And so 5 gallons is an extraordinary amount, right? So anyway, so this brings me to my second section out of 3. That is, how did the temperance movement go about fighting against alcohol, and how did they seek to curb alcohol use by regular Americans? And here, really what I want to talk about is the way that at first, the temperance movement began to focus on individuals. So a temperance organizer would try to talk to you about the importance of restricting the amount of liquor you were drinking, and they would try to appeal to your soul, your sense of self-control, your desire to be a better person. But that kind of a movement changed, and ultimately what they began to look at is legislation. So instead of appealing to individuals, they started to look at how the government could get involved. So temperance activism became increasingly popular during the 1820s. And you remember from my graph that 1820 was the high water mark of alcohol drinking in America. And so what really prompted this concern and prompted the creation of these organizations was the sense that drunkards were a real problem in the democracy. They believed that drunkards were failing to live up to their responsibilities as good citizens, as good Christians, because the temperance activists were very strongly oriented to the Christian religion, and especially as members of families. And so you started to see temperance organizers really hitting home the idea that the American nation might fail as an experiment because there was so much drinking and so much excessive drinking. And so what they were doing then was really trying to use sort of Christian revival techniques almost to hammer home to individual citizens the importance of restricting, to moderate their alcohol use. They very much emphasized temperance, that is, drinking temperately, moderately, rather than drinking heavily. And so they began to focus on things like different ways of using the media and visual images to change people's hearts, to change people's minds about the role of alcohol. And I love this image here, showing you the sort of before and after thing. And you can see here that in this image, the text says, "True likenesses. Had this young man, when a boy, joined a juvenile temperance band, his once beautiful face would never have looked as you see in the next picture. 1 ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure." And so they began to talk about the evils of alcohol, the evils of the ways that drunk men beat each other up, the ways that drunkards would drink away their weekly earnings and have nothing left to feed their families. They talked about how intemperance was a sin, just like all the other sins that Christians worried about. And so what they tried to do was come up with sort of innovative ways of getting people to change their ways. And one way was to hand out cards, sort of temperance organization cards that people literally signed. "I promise not to drink heavily. I promise to be a temperate drinker." And those kinds of pledges, the sort of signing your name to a document, just like you might sign your name to a contract or sign your name to another kind of a promise. It was a kind of religiously infused way of encouraging people to curb their alcohol use. And what they also began to do was emphasize that it wasn't enough just to be a temperate drinker. It wasn't enough to be a moderate drinker. They started to emphasize total abstinence from alcohol. And so you started to see, there are images like this one of an army of children. They called them the Cold Water Army. And so children could join these organizations and then, with their big, beautiful eyes, look at their parents and say, "Daddy, have you signed the Temperance Pledge?" And so these nice little boys, all of them dressed as neatly as possible, marching in lockstep together and holding signs that say total abstinence and no alcohol. These kinds of movements brought in not just men who had drinking problems, but whole families, women, children, little boys, little girls, all of them oriented to encouraging people to see alcohol in an entirely new light. And, I have to say that what's perverse about the Cold Water Army is that in the 1820s and 30s, when these kinds of images were coming out, when children were being encouraged to join the Cold Water Army, the water was still terrible. The water still made you sick. And in fact, this is an image from the 1830s. During that time, there were cholera epidemics throughout the United States. Cholera is this horrible, fatal, diarrheal disease that passes from one person to another when the fecal matter of a sick person gets into the water supply, and then everyone is drinking this foul water and then getting so sick they can't recover. Richmond in 1832 had a cholera epidemic that killed 3% of the population. And so Cold Water Army sounds great, but still really not a good idea. Okay, so the temperance movement then, starting in the 1820s and continuing throughout the 19th century, grew enormously popular. I mean, so popular, in fact, that you started to see something like, even by the late 1830s, over 1 million people joining and signing the pledge of either moderation or total abstinence. You had thousands of local and state societies cropping up that people could join. People could go to lectures, people could have discussions about the importance of temperance. And you started to see a radical drop in the amount of alcohol people were drinking. I mean, such that, as I mentioned before, you know, in 1820, people were drinking over 5 gallons of hard liquor every year. Well, look at what you see by 1840. It had dropped to about 2 gallons. That's an enormous, crazy drop. And I think what's really interesting about this movement is that, you know, we often, as students, learn about some of the other really hugely important reform movements of the same period. Movements like the fight to abolish slavery, for example. But temperance was probably the most popular reform in the 19th century, bar none. Many people, as we will see, joined either the temperance organization or an abolition organization, and those two movements fed off each other, and it fed a sort of religiously inspired desire to make America a better place, and really infused ordinary men and women and children in the US to believe that they could play a role in making the US a better place. Okay, so then what you started to see is a gradual shift. So no matter how popular temperance was, nevertheless, some in the organization felt that it wasn't quite enough. And so you started to see new movements, not just to change individual people's souls, to make them want to drink less, to make them want to join organizations, but you actually found them wanting to get the government to enact coercive legislation that actually stopped people from drinking as much. And so, for example, in the 1830s, there were efforts to actually restrict the way that alcohol was sold. So most famously in Massachusetts, they passed the 15-gallon law, which was a law that said that no one could purchase alcohol in any amount less than 15 gallons. And now this meant that you can't go into a bar and buy a drink. You can't go to a store and buy a bottle. You can't buy a 6-pack as we would do today. Instead, only the people who had the money to buy 15 gallons at a time, that is, the wealthiest of all people, could buy alcohol at all. And so what that meant, of course, was this deeply undemocratic sort of movement to try to figure out how to get poor people, poor people knew very well that they were being targeted with laws like this, get poor people to stop drinking. In addition, you started to see movements to eliminate the sale of alcohol on Sundays, which is still something that we see in the US. The rules for selling alcohol in Virginia, for example, are different for Sundays than for other days of the week. There was also the movement to prevent local cities and towns from issuing liquor licenses to people who wanted to open up a bar. So that meant that then only the state legislature could license a bar. And that meant that they would actually restrict the number of bars in any area. In the 1860s, people started to pass these civil damage laws, which meant that if I got really drunk at a bar and then I went out and beat somebody up, not only could that victim sue me, but they could sue the owner of the bar who sold me all that booze. And that way you actually found bar owners themselves getting enlisted in the battle to sort of restrict people's alcohol intake. And then finally, what you started to see in the 1880s was cities, counties, and even entire states working to either go completely dry or to have very restrictive legislation so that all alcohol was somehow restricted in terms of how it was sold. And so, for example, if you look here on the left, in 1893, you can see that there are a few states in white that have gone completely dry. That is, no alcohol could be sold. But there were also counties and large areas of different states. The states that are shaded had restrictions about how alcohol could be sold. So even by 1893, you were already seeing significant change, but look at how extensive that had become by 1910. So less than 20 years later, and this is, 1910 is before the passage of the 18th Amendment. This is before prohibition on a national level, but you can already see how pervasive those restrictions had become. Okay, so the last section I'm going to talk about here has to do with women, about how crucial women were to the fight against alcohol. And I think what's so interesting about this is how much women benefited at first from portraying themselves and other women as helpless victims of drunk husbands, and then benefiting from their fury at their sense of themselves as helpless victims. And so, for example, look at this great image here, this great temperance poster. Which gets your vote, mother or the saloon? I mean, who's going to say the saloon, right? So they're urging men, that is the only people who could vote at this time, to vote for the helpless women who suffer when America is full of drunkards. Okay, so, I've already talked about how important visual images were to the temperance movement. This is a classic one here. A man, comes home drunk after a long night of drinking. You can see that they live in poverty. They don't have a fancy home at all. And he comes home and he's already enraged. He's a drunkard and he starts to beat up his wife. His poor children are clinging onto him. A neighbor sort of springs through the door. I mean, this is a classic image from the temperance movement, an image that portrays drunk men as the problem, and women and families as the victims of the demon drink. And so what they do is focus on the ways that drink made people more violent. It made those men drink away their incomes so that, families lived in poverty. It made families, in fact, suffer so much that they could never raise themselves out of poverty. And so if you started to extrapolate that to a larger American society, what you saw is the creation of a permanent underclass of people, a permanent class of people who were riddled with drink, and drink was sort of the generator of their misery and prevented them from getting out of this kind of situation. These stories, it's not that women didn't drink alcohol, but if you look at most of the temperance organizing, a lot of the narratives that they circulated about the problem of alcohol, they focus on men. And what this did was portray women as victims. And I don't want to say that they weren't. There's a lot of reason to see that, in fact, alcohol was a terrible thing for families. But that was an incredibly interesting focus, the focus on women as victims. Because what it did was it reminded women that, if alcohol was on the ballot, up or down, do you want to vote to allow alcohol in your community or prevent it? Women had no vote. They had no vote. They had no ability to hold office. They had no ability to really get a divorce. Divorce was extremely rare. Even if women were allowed to get divorced, they wouldn't have been able to take their children with them. In addition, if women did get divorced and they did lose their children, they had no real way of supporting themselves because women's pay was so profoundly lower than men's at this time. I mean, most women made in a day between working women between about a quarter to a half of what men made. And so this was, it just wasn't possible for women to see any way out except to restrict the kind of alcohol that drunk husbands were able to get their hands on. And so what they had to do was they had to rely on, they had to lobby in some way the government, their local government, their state government, the US government, to get those men to vote in a way that would restrict alcohol. That was their only path forward. And it was incredibly enraging that women had to put themselves in that position. It just reminded them of their overall political weakness during this period. And you know, again, you can look at this image here, wet or dry. When you look at the image of the woman with her children, she's got her, you know, her big eyes. She's got her sort of helpless look. She can't do anything except hope that you will see her as a helpless victim and you will vote accordingly, right? So what this did by the later, after the Civil War in the US, was lead a lot of people to actually form women's temperance organizations, and especially more than any other, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. This was founded originally in 1873. It was an incredibly powerful and widespread organization, all organized by women. And what those women did was spend their time lobbying in every way they could imagine to get people to restrict alcohol. At the same time, they did really interesting things to try to achieve that, including, as you can see in this image here, they would march with their best clothes on, their Sunday best, their hats, their shawls, etc., into saloons, and they would pray. And if you want a scene that will ruin the mood of a bar, maybe have a bunch of middle-class women march in and start praying in the middle of your bar, right? And so there's a way in which that their actions like this reminded everyone of their respectability. And they reminded people, I think that, you know, in a lot of ways, the temperance organization was very oriented to respectability, to reminding people that if you want to be a respectable American, you don't drink so much. You don't become a fool in public. Also, if you want your family to raise itself, you know, to engage in upward mobility in America, you don't drink so much. You curb your alcohol use. And so in all of these ways, these scenes of these apparently nice middle-class women, you know, praying in bars to get, you know, saloon keepers to feel bad about serving up those drinks, that was a really powerful message. They also arranged to build water fountains in towns. And so you can see in this one, this is from a little town in Iowa. They actually built the water fountains because they believed that maybe men wouldn't drink so much if they had fresh water that they could drink. And they actually put the WCTU label at the very top of the water fountain. So at first what they did was urge local organizations and towns to build these water fountains. And then they simply started raising enough money to build them themselves. You also, though, started to see that what resulted from all of this, from women's, you know, by now 50 years of organizing on behalf of temperance and their activity within the WCTU and other organizations like it, is that women became really savvy activists. They learned political activism at the grassroots level. And so what you started to see was people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, two famous women who initially joined temperance organizations and abolition organizations, and from there became women's rights activists. You started to see Frances Harper, who likewise got her start as an abolitionist and then moved toward temperance and moved toward women's rights. you started to see all of these women beginning to advocate for women getting the vote so that women could play a better and more productive role in American society. Women got experience not just belonging to organizations and strategizing about how you could end alcohol abuse in the US, but you also saw them developing public speaking skills, leadership skills, and maybe even, rabble-rousing kinds of skills to get people to care more about fighting against alcohol. And they even lobbied legislators. They lobbied state members of the state house. They lobbied members of government to get them to change. And all of this activity, again, reminded women that they needed the vote. They needed the vote to actually get anywhere as political actors in American society. In a democracy, if you're most, according to the women at the time, if you're most moral and religious and dedicated members of society couldn't vote, then how could the United States become a better place? How could this possibly improve over time? And so this led many of these people, including these famous 3 women, to fight for women's right to vote. There were also women who acted outside of organizations, and this included Kerry Nation. I keep telling my friends that I'm going to dress as Kerry Nation for Halloween one of these years. I love her so much. Well, she was slightly mad. She was a very religious woman who'd lived in Texas and other places in the Midwest and had a drunk husband that she contended with. And at some point felt that God had spoken to her and called on her to be a temperance advocate. And so what she did was, rather than join temperance organizations, she would take a hatchet and go into bars and break them apart. She would break up all the furniture. She'd break up the bottles and the barrels of booze. And she became famous because she was arrested so many times. Sometimes she was beaten up by angry bar owners and angry drinkers in those bars. But you can see here that she had a terrific sort of cultural effect as what do you want to call her? A sort of religious terrorist or a righteous, violent woman acting on behalf of what she thought was her religious calling to end alcohol in the US. And in fact, she was arrested many, many times and fined. The way she paid her fines and her, her bail money was she sold souvenir hatchets to people. You can still see these on, eBay coming up, the sort of Kerry Nation hatchet. You can get your own. She also gave public lectures. So, all of these topics, I think, raise a lot of bigger questions about why temperance was such a powerful site for women to act as activists and to become more politically involved, even as they couldn't yet vote. Women couldn't vote until 1920. And so what you see is temperance highlighted for many, many women in the US all the ways in which they were politically helpless. They were, at the mercy of their husbands. Their husbands were the breadwinners. Their husbands were the ones who kept the family together and paid the rent. Their husbands were the ones who, if they were drunk, could ruin any chance for the family to succeed in the US. And what that meant was that, stepping back and seeing that this wasn't just a woman's own individual problem, but the problem of many women in the US, it showed them that maybe together they could start to act in ways that could change the US for the better, could change women's place in the US for the better. And so it gave them all of this experience organizing, again, forefronting their religious beliefs at the center of their activism, and then taking public action in all kinds of ways. So, in all of these ways, it gave women through temperance a pathway to fighting for the right to vote, to argue that what the US needs is a whole set of new voters who are religiously and morally motivated to make the US a better place. And so, I mean, you know, I've talked about three things today. I've talked about why Americans began to see alcohol as a problem during a period when they drank like there was no tomorrow. I've talked about the ways that the temperance movement moved from trying to target individual souls to really going for big legislative change. And then finally, I talked about why women became involved and how meaningful temperance organizing was for many women to become more active as public members of American society. And I think that in a lot of ways, you can see how it's not a surprise that, you know, the Prohibition Amendment was passed in 1919, the 18th Amendment. The very next amendment, the 19th Amendment, was the one that gave women the right to vote in 1920. And that connection that within a year of each other is really not a surprise. And then finally, I just wanted to point out that here in Richmond, we actually have a WCTU fountain, drinking fountain in Bird Park, a fountain that has this whole sort of text all about the importance of temperance and the importance of drinking water. And my favorite thing is at the very end, it has this little poem. The bravest battle that ever was fought, shall I tell you where and when? On the maps of the world, you'll find it not. 'Twas fought by the mothers of men. That's all I've got. Thank you very much.
And then Augie's going to get us, and then Augie's going to get us started on the second part of our program, which is sort of the enforcement issues with prohibition. No, there weren't any really. So have a drink and we'll get started. What did I just do?
Okay. We good, Ron?
We're all good.
Good evening. Good evening. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight to listen to Carolyn and myself. And before I get to my remarks, I would like to take this opportunity to thank a couple of people for organizing this and for making this run smoothly. First, Ryan, who's kind of sort of walking to the seats right now. Let's give her a round of applause because she's making us sound and look probably better than we really are. And then second, the library faculty person who organizes this event and is responsible for VCU maintaining its support for something that's actually required by federal law, which is Constitution Day, Nia Rogers. As Nia pointed out, the focus of my remarks is what happened after Prohibition occurred. So Carolyn walked us through the movement that led to Prohibition. One of the very few times in US history to where in our Constitution, we actually took something away from the American public. So we get the 18th Amendment ratified. But as I will discuss, just because there is a clause or a section of the US Constitution doesn't mean it just immediately, magically, wonderfully gets executed. So we're going to talk about, in particular, a law passed by the United States Congress known as the Volstead Act, which was the law that was enforcing the actual provisions of Prohibition. As Nia pointed out, enforcement was difficult. And I'll spend a few moments talking about why in hell enforcement was so difficult. And then I'm going to wrap up by talking about some of the lessons from Prohibition that perhaps are applicable to other public policy problems or challenges. So I like to tell my students when I teach constitutional law that just because there is something in the Constitution doesn't mean that it gets enforced or is implemented or is self-executing. So an example of this would be if the United States federal government entered into a treaty with another nation. The treaty, per the language of the US Constitution, becomes the law of the land. But most treaties are just general agreements. So then the United States Congress has to pass a law to enforce the treaty. Or one of my favorite provisions of the US Constitution, and I believe the bane of NIA's existence, is the Commerce Clause given to the United States Congress in Article 1, Section 8. So Congress gets to regulate interstate commerce. So what? What we've had is a series of laws over 200 plus years of where Congress has regulated commerce between the states. Likewise with the 8th Amendment, all right? Or excuse me, the 18th Amendment. Officially, the title of the law was the National Prohibition Act, but it's known for the chairperson of the Judiciary Committee in the House of Representatives, one Representative Wolstead. It was passed in 1919 and it began to be enforced in 2020. Its basic purpose was to prohibit intoxicating beverages, or as Carolyn described it in her remarks, okay, the demon beverage, right? The devil's beverage. I think one of my favorite descriptions of alcohol was liquid bread, all right? Liquid bread. Now, it was designed to go ahead and regulate the manufacture, sale, distribution, and use of high proof spirits. There was a number of exceptions. One of the most prominent was you could still manufacture alcohol for scientific and other business uses. So, and this becomes a theme in regards to the enforcement of the Volstead Act, a number of businesses during the 1920s applied for patents from the US Patent Office for new and scientific uses of alcohol, many of which required testing, okay, and consumption by American consumers, because you wanted to make sure that your product was ready for sale and distribution. A very important word in this law was intoxicating. And the way the federal government interpreted that particular word in the law was anything ingestible that contained more than 0.5% alcohol. Now, Carolyn, in her remarks, okay, made various distinctions in regards to alcohol that was consumed throughout the history of the United States, but particularly early on in our country's history. 0.5% alcohol is not a lot of alcohol, right? You would have to drink quite a bit to get drunk. So that was one of the purposes of the law. I want you to keep that in mind as we discuss what actually happened in regards to enforcement. So even the lightest of wines, the weakest of beers, etc., could not be manufactured, sold, and distributed in the United States. And again, remember, okay, even after the 1820s, Americans were still consuming vast quantities of alcohol. So this was going to be a shock, okay, even with the temperance movement that had been in existence for nearly 100 years. There were a number of exceptions with the Volstead Act. One of the most prominent was you were able to consume whatever you possessed before the law was passed. Now, again, remember, we get prohibition, then later that year, the Volstead Act gets passed, but then it takes a year before it gets enforced. Can you imagine what many Americans who liked alcohol did in that roughly year and a half? They went out and purchased, stole, produced a whole bunch of alcohol so they could have it on hand in their homes, in their businesses, etc. Another exception, this became known as the fruit juice exception. Ciders and fruit juices that had any amount of alcohol were exempted from the Volstead Act. This led to a number of American companies to shift from making beer or hard liquor, and all of a sudden they went into the fruit juice industry. This occurred with such, shall we say, speed in development that at one point, the governor of California was concerned that vineyards in the state of California were overgrowing and that they might have to go ahead and stop producing, again, air quotes, fruit juice because the soil in California could not handle all of the excess growing of grapes. A third exception, alcohol, like whiskey, prescribed by doctors was exempted from the Volstead Act. This led to doctors coming up with some rather novel uses of alcohol as remedies for any manner of physical maladies that you might encounter on a daily basis. The subsection of the medical profession that really exploited this were dentists, who began to prescribe whiskey as a way to address toothaches. And if any of you have encountered grandmothers or great-grandmothers who would go ahead and tell you if you had a toothache, just rub some whiskey on it, it is actually rooted in the 1920s because that became a rather familiar prescription. But just to go ahead and make a comparison today and how many of our public policy problems aren't new, think about the role of doctors with the opiate crisis. This was a similar type of experience in the 1920s because many doctors, okay, were writing prescriptions for alcohol, all right? Drugstores and perfumers added alcohol to various substances that they sold. This became a significant problem because many Americans so badly wanted to get access to their alcohol that they started consuming products that had any amount of alcohol, even if it did damage. The Food and Drug Administration was created in 1916. The complaints in regards to perfumes and other drugs during the 1920s skyrocketed. Now, there were various enforcement problems, and I break these up into categories. The first category you could probably label cultural/economic. Liberty in the United States historically has been a prominent cultural, constitutional, and political value. A good recent example is the pushback or challenges to various federal and state laws in regards to the pandemic. You can't tell me what to do with my body. Likewise, many Americans in the 1920s kind of thought it was problematic, offensive, that the government was telling them that they could not consume alcohol. As Carolyn, I think, very ably went ahead and pointed out in her remarks, you could plausibly make the argument that the United States was a nation founded on alcohol. From the amount of alcohol that was consumed, the amount of alcohol that was manufactured, distributed, the fact that many of the framers of the US Constitution were distillers. Easily a half a dozen of them were, including our first president. Many of the waves of immigrants in the United States who settled, alcohol consumption was a fundamental part of the culture that they brought to the United States. And this is one of the, shall we say, insidious parts of the temperance movement, was that many of the groups that were targeted, okay, were immigrant groups. And this became an element of the United States nativist movement. It had a huge economic role. Alcohol historically has always played a huge role economically in the United States. At various points in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, alcohol manufacturing and sales comprised nearly 20% of the nation's economy. I want you guys to think about that. At various points in our country's history, 1/5 of our GDP is somehow related to alcohol. That's just an astonishing percentage, okay? It was a source of tax revenue. So in 1895, the Supreme Court in the Pollock case held that the then version of the income tax was unconstitutional. So what did the federal government turn to as a source of revenue? Well, if you're talking about manufacture, distribution, and sale of alcohol being 20% of the nation's economy, it became a primary source of tax revenue in the United States, which makes it all the more stunning that prohibition was added as an amendment to the Constitution. Another part of the enforcement narrative is federalism. This idea that the power of the nation's government is divided between states and the central government. The Wolstead Act situated enforcement within the Internal Revenue Service of the Treasury Department. Now, you might be wondering, why would tax agents be given the task of enforcing a prohibition on alcohol? Well, if you think about how IRS agents typically force people to comply with a law that they don't want to comply with, then it kind of sort of makes sense that the IRS might be asked to enforce this law. But the IRS was a relatively new federal agency. Remember, the income tax does not get added to the US Constitution as a power of the federal government until the 16th Amendment earlier in the 19-teens. So you're talking about an agency with limited capacity and personnel. Again, guys, does that sound vaguely familiar to today? Right? All states in the country passed their own versions of the Volstead Act. Again, this reflects federalism, particularly because economic matters that were contained within a state, per Supreme Court precedent at that time, were the control of state governments. But again, many states, like the federal government, had limited enforcement capacity. And in many states, and recall the maps that Carolyn put up, even if they were dry, you still had significant percentages of their population who wanted to do what? Drink. So you had varied enforcement across the country, in part because of federalism. The other difficulty in enforcing the Wolstead Act was geography. The United States as a large country, okay, with a lot of different borders, it is very difficult to enforce a nationwide ban on any kind of product. So for instance, neighbors to the north, Canada, also enacted prohibition. They were less rigorous, if that's possible, than even the United States in enforcing prohibition. And many of the distillers and brewers in Canada kind of sort of resented prohibition because a huge percentage of their profits every year came from American consumers. So Sam Bronfman, for instance, okay, exhibited this quite well in Canada. The Bahamas, you might be thinking, well, how did Bahamas contribute to the enforcement problems? Well, many European distillers and brewers would ship their alcohol to the Bahamas. Then boats from the Bahamas would go about 3 to 5 miles outside the US territorial property, drop off their loads, and then bootleggers in the United States devised various techniques to pick up their loads and then sell the alcohol in the United States. And again, you have an enforcement problem here because you would need personnel trained in the ways of criminals to figure out how alcohol was being shipped into the United States. And Canada's got a huge border. The US-Canadian border is huge. So how do you go ahead and regulate or enforce the Volstead Act with such a huge border? A fourth problem, the rise of organized crime organizations. Now, contrary to what Hollywood and popular media kind of sort of suggested at that time, organized crime existed in the United States pre-prohibition, right? Pre-prohibition. Well, what was noteworthy about organized crime in this era, okay, was how effective they became at providing a product that now the government said was illegal. And this is kind of sort of economics 101. The demand was still there. The government made it more difficult for you to get that product. So who stepped into the void? Organized crime organizations. And this is a cautionary tale that perhaps we have seen revisited with other markets and other regulatory efforts going forward in the future. The fifth enforcement problem I wanted to mention is your garden variety public policy compliance issue. We know this historically. When we ask the government to enforce an unpopular law, the government may have to pay those tasked with enforcement much higher salary, benefits, if you're going to attract committed individuals. Did the United States Congress appropriate the necessary monies to attract those kinds of talented, committed individuals? Short answer is no, right? What did this lead to? Significant bribery and non-compliance issues. One of the most effective techniques of organized crime families of this era was the amount of money they would set aside to pay off government officials tasked with enforcing the Volstead Act. It was typically viewed by organized crime organizations as a part or a cost of doing business. Another element of public policy compliance is, what if you arrest somebody for violating the Wolstead Act? You're going to go to court. But the courts were understaffed and typically unable to address the large number of cases that arose from individuals who were found to have violated either the federal version of the Volstead Act or the state versions. The result was, for many in government, but also for many in the public. By the way, public opinion polls in the 1920s were very scarce, but those that were taken indicated that by the end of the decade, most Americans viewed the Volstead Act as an annoyance. And because the voting public viewed it as an annoyance, increasingly members of Congress and executive branch officials also thought it was an annoyance. Now, was prohibition a complete failure? Well, if one of the measures of success or failure of prohibition was, did it get Americans to stop drinking? The answer is yes. Alcohol consumption during that decade fell. Some estimates are nearly 30% of the overall alcohol consumption in the United States. In public policy literature, when you can get that kind of change in a negative condition, and remember Carolyn's remarks, excessive or abusive drinking was viewed as a public policy problem. If you can get that kind of change, okay, you would say the law is successful. Arrests for drunkenness fell. That's good. Fewer Americans were in jail, which means if they're not in jail, they're perhaps working. If they're working, okay, then the socioeconomic condition of their families improves, okay? We get greater worker productivity, a lot of, if you will, positives. Price for illegal alcohol rose higher than the average worker could afford. So again, this provides a disincentive for Americans to engage in excessive drinking. But when the post-war, and when I'm talking about war, I'm talking about World War I, economy rebounded. The previous slides, the previous variables that I just described, all led to implementation of prohibition being mitigated. And what I'm going to conclude with are some perhaps valuable lessons going forward from our experience with prohibition. One, just because you pass an amendment doesn't necessarily mean that a condition is going to change. Carolyn, in her remarks, mentioned the 19th Amendment, the amendment that gave women the right to vote. It actually took 2, if not, 3 decades before women's participation in voting in the United States got anywhere close to the participation rates of men. So again, just because an amendment gets passed doesn't mean, voila, okay, we're going to have enforcement. There are a multitude of variables in regards to policy implementation. One of the lessons of prohibition is how little advocates for prohibition actually thought about implementing prohibition. And by the way, this is a lesson that many movement groups learn when they want broad policy change. Once you get the policy change written into law, or in this case, the Constitution, you still have to go ahead and make sure that the government implements it so you get the policy change. The Constitution or the law is the statement. Then you have to flesh out the details. Economics matters. And I know some of you are like, Augie, I've tried to avoid economics in my young lives so far, and I'm hoping to get through my degree without focusing on economics. But our experience with prohibition really does demonstrate, some of the basic fundamental tenets of economics. What happens when the government makes a legal market illegal? When it creates, if you will, a black market. If the demand still exists, you still have public policy problems that will occur. Think about, for instance, and I'm neither advocating for or against this, I'm just using it as an example, the war on drugs in the United States. Part of the difficulty with the war on drugs over the last 4 or 5 decades, I mean, if you take it back as far as the Nixon administration, is that unless you curb demand for a particular product, it is almost impossible to rid yourself of the problems associated with the demand for that product. And then last, cultural norms, cultural behavior, cultural beliefs are a significant important when you talk about the United States Constitution or public policy writ large. You are trying to change people's behavior. Again, think back to Carolyn's remarks a few moments ago. You had a movement that was trying to change what had been, for most of our country's history, a fundamental element of the American, if you will, daily existence. A small amount of whiskey in the morning, a little bit at lunch, okay? Something in the afternoon to take the edge off. On the way home, you might get some more. And now you want to go ahead and stop that. So part of the enforcement challenge of prohibition was, how do you get a whole bunch of Americans who, whether it's because they didn't have, healthy water to drink, or the fact they just like the taste of alcohol, to stop wanting to taste alcohol? And that's the end of my presentation. I think at this time, Nia,
do questions and we have a mic.
We have a mic, okay?
So if you have a question, if you raise your hand, Brian's gonna run the room. She'll come to you with a microphone. Because not everybody is as loud as Augie and I, who's back in the room. So if anybody have any questions to get started? Oh, thank you. Thank you.
This question is for Professor Eastman. When did politicians start, or did politicians start running as prohibitionists during the mid 1800s, or like when did they start doing that?
Like when they were actually running for office and they sort of anchored themselves to the prohibition cause. So actually there were entire political parties dedicated to prohibition. And so there were people, running on a prohibition ticket. I want to say in the 1850s. I'm gonna have to check on that. But
Well,
I mean, this was very popular.
Yeah, well, one such example is in one of the pictures in Carolyn's presentation was the Anti-Saloon League, which was a very prominent temperance movement organization. They would actually run full tickets in certain local elections or state elections, typically in the Midwest and South, where you saw a lot of support for the temperance movement, much earlier than the urban areas or the coastal areas, okay? The Anti-Saloon League, ASL.
Yeah. And they got started a little bit later in the 19th century. But yeah, I mean, prohibition was such a popular movement that you did start to see politicians sort of anchoring themselves to that cause pretty early. Or they would declare their own, temperance or their belonging to a temperance organization. It's a great question.
Hi, this is a question for Professor Augenbaugh. So I was just curious, out of all those issues with implementation, I guess ultimately would you say it was the annoyance and the lack of them really wanting to do it? Because it makes me think of something like Brown v. Board of Education that had such hurdles to get over with implementation, but they really brought it the entire way and really saw it through as opposed to the Volstead Act.
Well, to your question and your comparison to Brown versus Board, I think is a good illustration. When Congress with the Volstead Act did not fully support it in terms of appropriation, but also in terms of authorization for the Treasury Department, in many ways, it wasn't a big surprise that the Volstead Act ended up failing. Because what we saw with Brown versus Board was, even after the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown, the first Brown case, but then the second one where the court said desegregation was to occur with all deliberate speed, what really turned the tide, according to many scholars, was Congress in 1965 passing the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that basically told state governments, if you want a whole bunch of education money, you have to do what? Desegregate. And there's a really important lesson there in regards to how the political branches have to go ahead and support what's in the Constitution. Otherwise, it's, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, it's like a statement. But what's the effect? What's the practical effect? And that's where Congress needs, sometimes has to step up, or state governments needed to step up.
Thank you.
This is for Professor Guzman. Is it? Did I get that? Eastman. Okay. So the drawings that you showed of the family with the man coming home drunk, I am wondering if you would perhaps see The Simpsons as a kind of modern day comparison to those drawings. As funny as it might sound, I'm wondering if there might be some intellectual value to that program today. Is it a modern day commentary on perhaps an ongoing issue today?
Oh, that's fantastic. deaf beer as a sort of, the problem in The Simpsons, as if that were the only problem in The Simpsons, right? No, that's great.
But I
because-
like your connection there. I like how you brought that forward, because I don't think of all the years of watching The Simpsons, I would have ever connected it to the temperance movement, okay? But
I mean,
nevertheless.
I think Marge is a temperance hero.
That comment. And what's really interesting about that is that in the 19th century, you only saw people idealizing what family life should look like, right?
Yeah.
So you only saw in women's magazines maybe glossy images of happy middle class or wealthy families gathered around the Christmas tree, but in the symptom, by the end of the 20th century, what we have, in fact, is a family in which everything has gone wrong, right? I mean, the children disobey the parents, and the father is useless, and the entire set of adults in the whole show are they're hopelessly stupid. Yeah, it really points to how much things have changed. Thank you.
And to Carolyn's point there, one of the more fascinating things about the rise of the temperance movement in the United States was how much it was rooted in many ways to middle class, second, third generation women's, if you will, perception of what should be appropriate behavior.
Absolutely.
Okay, which meant that part of the temperance movement's success was rooted in something that I mentioned in my comments about being anti-immigrant, because there were a lot of stereotypes about successive waves of immigrant groups, about how they were drunks, lazy, and there was a connection to the consumption of booze and worker productivity, and they can't take care of their families, and look at the conditions they're willing to live in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if we get rid of, the demon, liquid, then all of a sudden they will have, vibrant democratic families with, husbands who are going out and acting like the breadwinner, et cetera, which again was nowhere close to the existence of most American families at that time. But that's what was being portrayed, right? And again, when you're doing a policy movement, okay, you need the images, you need the rhetoric for what will be better if we do X, right?
That's true, but I'm going to argue with you just a little
Okay.
bit there, Augie,
Good.
because it's true that a lot of the images that I showed you, look how much they're oriented to a white middle class, right? Or white wealthy people. I mean, it's as if those are the only people that matter. But in fact, when you see the amount of alcohol drunk per capita in the US drop from more than 5 gallons down to 2 within 20 years of American history, what you are actually seeing is, yes, the movement emphasizing certain kinds of middle class ideals about family life, but many working class people, as well as some immigrants, immigrants like the Irish and the Germans that had, enthusiastic drinking traditions, they were sort of quietly restricting the amount of alcohol as well. So yes, it had this kind of middle class set of ideals, but I think many, many more people saw that maybe temperance was their way up the social ladder. Maybe if they restricted their drinking, their family too could raise themselves in American society.
This can be a question for either of you, but on the subject of speakeasies and other loopholes around prohibition, was it more already business owners that were doing these, or was it more other people who saw it as a cash grab opportunity that began running the speakeasies?
There's evidence to support both sides of the dichotomy you presented in your question, because you did have bars and saloons that when Prohibition hit, okay, were kind of sort of forced to reorient their business operations. But one of the ways in states where individuals were able to avoid prosecution is if they said they went to a speakeasy and they brought their own booze. So as long as the establishment was not selling alcohol, okay, they had a legal justification in court for saying, but technically I didn't violate Volstead. And depending on the judge or the state, they would be found not guilty.
That's right. I don't have anything to add to that. Thank you.
There were a couple other issues where things got kind of likened to common issues that we're working through either recently in history or today. I was kind of wondering if you saw any parallels between the modern labor rights issues going on and the push for unionization versus the actual labor rights issues with the Industrial Revolution, and if that might have increased alcohol rates and kind of pushed us further towards temperance or prohibition.
Interesting.
Because on one hand, you had the scientific management movement at the turn of the 20th century, where you had analysts go into a manufacturing plant to figure out the one best way to do something. And if you're a worker and you were showing up slightly intoxicated or drunk, okay, you would not be able to perform the one best way, right?
Right.
Okay, on the other hand, okay, that kind of routinization and focus on money as a motivator for workers, as we're seeing with the current, if you will, resurrection of the labor movement, it's not just about money, it's quality of work life, right? So, I mean, to your question, I mean, are you kind of sort of suggesting that workplaces today need to go ahead and make alcohol available as a quality of work life?
I mean, I like that idea. I'll definitely take that a note. Mostly I was kind of wondering, you know, to what kind of extent we could say there's a cause and effect relationship between industrial revolution work conditions, kind of like causing alcoholism and that itself pushing people towards, you know, temperance.
I was thinking about the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin,
Okay.
which was written, I mean, Franklin died in 1791, right? So he died long before the temperance movement got started. But what he describes about his young life was working in print shops where all the workers were drunk. And he found that really offensive. And so he demanded that not only would he not have any alcohol while he worked, but that his boss pay him the difference. So, you know, in other words, all the other workers were making their salary and effectively buying their booze from their boss. And Franklin would make a little bit more because he wasn't drinking any of the whiskey or the rum or whatever it was. And so that book was published in the 1790s and became hugely popular for decades afterward. And many temperance organizers used it as a rationale for workers to stop giving their workers liquor while they were on the job. And so I think there's a really interesting way in which, on the one hand, some workers wouldn't have wanted to work for a boss that didn't give them liquor during the day. It was so much a part of everyday life. But some might have found other reasons to believe that they could actually get ahead in American society because they weren't drinking on the job and therefore impressing their bosses and so on. So I'm not sure you could say it had a radical effect either way, for or against prohibition or temperance, but I do think that you started to see a lot more sort of divisions within American society and how labor functioned, what labor looked like. That is an excellent question.
I just have one more question just for both of you. I guess the prohibition often gets compared to like the war on drugs specifically, obviously because of those similarities. The differences, there seem to be significant differences as well, like just how ubiquitous and robust it, like you say, it was a legal market that all of a sudden was made illegal, whereas, you know, a lot of the drug trade black markets essentially always been illegal, or it's grown more robust while still being illegal. Does the pre-Volstead Act efforts that seem to bring it down like from 5 gallons to 1 gallon maybe indicate that some kind of reduction can be possible, but outright abolition tends to have a negative side effect?
You know, it's such an important question. And I think it's really difficult to know. I was thinking about abortion, right? I'm thinking about the recent Supreme Court decision that basically allows states to make their own decisions about abortion. And we know how pervasive abortion restrictions will be, right? The fact is that if you make something illegal, many people, being good law-abiding citizens, are going to follow the law, right? And other people will not, because if you look at American history, women have always sought, some women have always sought and found abortions, you know, because that is an important part of figuring out one's reproductive life. And so I think that there's a lot of ways that you could say that, yes, there probably was a reduction because it was illegal. People felt that it was important not to drink. I mean, according to lore, my great-grandmother never touched a drop of alcohol because she grew up during the Prohibition era, and you know, that was the law. You just didn't do it. And she believed all that stuff about how if you wanted to, you know, make it into the middle class, you restricted your alcohol consumption. And so I don't know what to say about that. You know, I think that it's in general, as Augie was saying about the 18th Amendment, it's very often a bad move to take rights away from people, because people then question the legitimacy of a government that takes away rights. And so I think that we'll probably see both, right? We'll see some people going ahead and abiding by the law and other people not.
Thank you.
Hi, I was curious about like the statistics, especially the ones like in support of like the supposed success of prohibition. Like, where did those come from? How are they collected? Because if it was self-report, then you have like the concern that people were lying, because obviously like it was a time it was illegal. And historically, it's been hard to like conduct a lot of studies.
Can you speak a little bit more into your mic? I'm sorry.
Oh,
Thank
sure.
you. Thank you.
Yeah, so I was just like asking about the statistics, especially like supporting the idea that prohibition was somewhat successful. Like, where did those come from? Were they self-report? Because if it's self-report, there's the concern for that, you know, they were lying because it was illegal. And would you consider them to be like very reliable? Because like historically, like there hasn't been like a lot of very in-depth studies on drugs, especially when they were illicit.
Part of the difficulty when trying to measure whether or not a law has an effect on a person or a group not engaging in a behavior is we don't know, okay, all the reasons why they might, you know, report one way or the other. And that was particularly the case in the 1920s. You know, as I mentioned, there wasn't a lot of public opinion polling in the 1920s. Part of the difficulty also in regards to prohibition is if you went ahead and said you were not complying with the Wolstead Act, you would basically be acknowledging that you were breaking the law. So we don't know to what extent you know, Americans were being truthful. We do have records about consumption, sales, distributions, arrests, etc., which again are imprecise measures of what actually went on during the 1920s with the Volstead Act implementing prohibition. So your question does get at one of the difficulties, right? I think there was one more question, or right?
Hi, this question is for you, Dr. Eastman. I was wondering if you noticed any other parallels between the recent legislation regarding the overturning of Roe v. Wade and the prohibition period, because something you mentioned, I noticed that there was a shift from the single person individual perspective to getting the government involved, which I found kind of sickening because in both instances, the people that were very religiously devout were at the center of it, asking for this change that would just make them more comfortable. Did you see any other parallels between these two movements?
Yeah, I think there are two possible parallels that come to me right away. One of them has to do with activists like Kerry Nation, right? These sort of people who were so driven by their religious belief that alcohol was horrific, that it was destroying America, that they were willing to go in and destroy bars. There's also the fact that during the temperance era, a lot of women, even within the movement, who were nice, sort of wannabe middle-class women, including Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, women's rights heroes, they were very effective at lobbying legislators, lobbying government officials, so that it became really difficult. If you were in elected office, it was very difficult to oppose temperance or abstinence or prohibition measures. Even if you were a drinker yourself, even if you enjoyed having that bottle of scotch on your, tabletop or whatever, you might very well publicly stand firm against the idea of allowing bars to get licensed. Maybe you might vote that your state become dry, in the 1890s or 1910s, because if you're constantly facing down all those women with their Sunday best on and their, religiously driven sort of message of total abstinence, it's very difficult to be the legislator who votes for booze. Who are you going to talk to? Are you going to vote for Mother or the saloon, right? So yeah, those are the two that really occur to me. You might have some others.
Well, another parallel that comes to my mind, and the temperance movement was not completely disconnected from a larger political movement at the turn of the 20th century, and that's the progressives. And one of the key assumptions of the progressive movement was that the government could change the lives of people, many of whom had behavioral traits or pathologies that the government knew best how to go ahead and remedy. And again, whether it is, religious organizations, calling for behavioral change, okay, or others, that's always one of the potential downsides when you turn to the government with its potentially awesome power, is that, at some point, you unleash the government to go ahead and say, we know what's best for you. Okay. And I've had students who get involved in interest groups who are like, I want to get a law passed. And I'm like, okay, but be careful what you wish for, right? Because you just might get it. But then it may go out of your hands or your control, right? And remember, one of the intermediate step or the initial step with the temperance movement was not government action, okay? It was trying to get individuals to moderate on their own behavior, okay? But when you ask that question, the first parallel that came to my mind was how the temperance movement was connected in many states and at the national government level with the progressive movement. And some of the things that the progressive movement did at the turn of the 20th century are not usually considered high watermarks of the American democracy. You know, see, you know, eugenics. And I don't know if we need to go there. Yes, sir.
So this is slightly off topic from prohibition, but there was a comment that you made in your presentation where you talked about how the voter turnout for women took many years before it caught up to that of the rate of men. And I was just wondering, would you say that that was primarily due to the state's reluctance to implement the law, or was there also a significant impact from, I guess, the time it took for the cultural mentality shift needed for women themselves to also see it as acceptable?
Well, we've actually seen this with pretty much every group who was previously disenfranchised, who then becomes franchised. There's usually at least a generation lag time before their participation rates match up with the broader population. We saw that with the former male slaves, and that got crushed rather quickly with Jim Crow laws in many southern border states. But you saw it with women, you saw it with 18-year-olds, okay? It usually takes a generation for it to become a part of their like political DNA, right? We've even seen this, for instance, with the waves of immigration in the mid to late 1800s and into the early 1900s. It usually takes until the second generation of an immigrant family or the third generation before they become politically active. Yeah.
I'll just add
Yeah.
one thing as a sort of a little sidebar here. So until about 1970, the federal drinking age was 18 in the US. And once all these states, one by one, began to raise that to the age of 21, and I think the last states to do it happened in the 1980s, is that right?
South Dakota. Yes.
Yeah, people would drive to these states just so they could drink legally. But because of the raising of the drinking age, you also saw the amount of alcohol drunk per capita go down as a result. So starting in 1970, you actually see it getting lower. Anyway, just a sidebar there.
I wouldn't know personally, but I had friends in my home state of Pennsylvania who would drive up to New York because New York had, for a period of time in my youth, a lower drinking age than did Pennsylvania. Yes. Again, I wouldn't know personally.
So one thing you mentioned was that there was upwards of, at one point, 20% sales of alcohol, and the manufacture of alcohol was like 20% of the nation's GDP.
Yes.
Was there any significant shift before Prohibition or after Prohibition to like get farther away from that number? Like, was that significant pre-World War II? Because I know after that it was really shifted to a manufacturing issue in terms of, not alcohol as much as most other kinds of products in terms of like construction.
Pre-Prohibition, okay? And in particular, when Congress took their first vote for Prohibition, sales of alcohol in the United States, I think, jumped almost 4.5% in less than a year. I mean, because all of the various proposals would basically grandfather in whatever you had, okay, in your homes. So a whole bunch of Americans started stocking up, okay? It was truly phenomenal, right?
I mean, what's so interesting about this, and Augie didn't get into it, but he could, I know, is that temperance organizers became, they walked in lockstep with the people fighting for a national income tax.
Yes.
Because the
Yes.
income tax meant that the US could replace all of that tax revenue that they used to get from booze with an income tax where every single American was just paying part of their salary to the US government. And so when
that became part of a key plank in the temperance movement was after the income tax becomes the 16th Amendment. Part of the temperance movement was we don't need to have so much booze being sold for tax revenue purposes. Okay, so it was almost became in part, depending on the state or the member of Congress, okay, a balanced budget argument, right? We don't need this substance anymore for taxing purposes because now we have a national income tax. So anybody who was making the justification, we need to continue to consume and sell a whole bunch of alcohol. Yeah, your argument just gets thrown out the window because we have an income tax now.
Yeah, and once you saw the booze get divorced from like the US being able to pay its own bills, then I mean, liquor manufacturers really started to see they were in trouble, right? Because they no longer had the government absolutely backing the continued existence of the manufacture and sale of alcohol.
And one of the most prominent lobbying efforts to get rid of prohibition, wealthy Americans, okay, who saw their tax liability go up dramatically after the 16th Amendment, because they were just like, if we get rid of prohibition, then we can resume taxing the sale of alcohol, which means that at worst, we're going to see our tax rates fall. At best, we might be able to get a repeal of the national income tax.
Yeah.
Unfortunately for them, what hit was the Great Depression. And actually, at one point during the 1930s, the highest tax rate actually went well over 50%, right?
Oh,
Yeah, okay, but
it was like 90%
at one point, yeah. But you know, your question really gets at some of the arguments that get made for and against prohibition have absolutely nothing to do with alcohol. And it had everything to do with generating tax revenue.
Yeah.
Right. And I know that sounds rather funny since we live in the 21st century and our federal government seems to want to just like print money. But at various points in our country history, where the federal government was going to get revenue, like dominated discussions. Yeah. Any other questions?
When it came to like the temperance, like suffragettes, people who like vote like women's right to vote, was there did they like snatch people from the temperance movement to like be like, hey, women's rights, or did it go like the other way? I don't know if that makes sense, but
You know, one of the things that's hard to appreciate now, because so many movements are so siloed from each other, is how much all these movements were tied together. And so if you go back to the 1830s, movements like temperance and the abolition of slavery were so popular and were utterly woven together. Likewise, the movement to end prostitution, the movement to promote world peace. I mean, there were all kinds of organizations, and what drove a lot of them was that deeply religious kind of view that we can make the United States a more perfect union. We can make it a better place. And so this continued by the late 18th century, 19th century, when you started to see temperance and women's rights sort of woven together. And a lot of people had different reasons for promoting women's rights to the vote. So some people would say that, well, women are better than men, we're more moral than men, and we're mothers, and that makes us have certain ideas, and so that's why we should be able to vote. And other people said that women need to be seen as equal to men in all ways. Some people fought bitterly against the women's right to vote because they felt that that would make women more like men. So, I mean, there's a lot of different views there, but yeah, for the most part, what you see is all of these movements are sort of deeply woven together. I didn't get a chance to talk more about, there were really important racial divisions
Yeah.
within the temperance movement. And so you had someone like Frances Harper, this amazing African-American activist and poet and author, who was very much sort of isolated out of the mainstream white women's Christian temperance union. So she had her own Black women's branch of it, but they had to exist sort of in parallel because the white women were, you know, invested in a certain kind of Jim Crow view of the United States. And so anyway, there's a much more that one can say about that movement, but
Yeah, if you think about the temperance movement, in many ways, it was truly remarkable. The various groups who at various times advocated for temperance, because otherwise, if you put them in a political party, they would not
oh,
exist.
they'd hate each other.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you know, for instance, in the South, one of the reasons why you saw quite a bit of support for the temperance movement was the attitude that we don't want people of color to be able to consume alcohol because they can't be trusted. And in other connections, and this goes back to a previous question that was asked, trying to remove religion or religious-oriented groups from some of our social movements throughout our country's history. I mean, the abolitionist movement in some parts of the United States would have never existed without religious groups,
Absolutely.
right? In some parts of the country, you don't get women's rights without religious groups advocating for them. On the other hand, like with any kind of policy movement, okay, there are at times potential downsides, right? But again, that's part and parcel to, you know, that, you know, little clause in the First Amendment, the right to peaceably assemble, right? And yes, guys, for those of you who know I teach constitutional law, you knew I was going to bring it back to the Constitution at some point, and I apologize.
So I just have one more comment before we all leave. For those of you who are curious about this bottle that he's got in his hand the entire time, I can smell it from here. It's coffee. He's a famous coffee drinker. And so I just want you all to know that he's been carrying this around, you know, like a security blanket the entire time. It is coffee, I promise. So anyway. Exactly.
Yeah, I do get asked that question with some regularity. It's always coffee, guys. I am a coffee addict. But nevertheless, since I just took the last swig of what was in this mug, you will never know. Anyways, thank you guys
Thank
so
you.
very much.